Greetings and welcome. We are in freshman English, honors English, and our objective now for the hour is to introduce you to Edith Hamilton's classic Mythology. That's the name of the book. And more particularly, an understanding of what we mean when we use this term mythology, and more particularly even than that, Greek mythology. So let's go to work. I want to begin by first of all just pointing out what and who Edith Hamilton is and why it's such an important text for us. Hamilton is what we call classical scholar. Now, when we use the term classics here, we're talking about other related to Greco-Roman thought. Okay? And in the process of her academic work, she realized that there was not a simple, for lack of a better phrase, clearinghouse or collection of all of the major Greek and Roman stories. And so what she did is she kind of comprised all that, compiled all that stuff, and then she kind of wrote summaries, I guess would be an easy way to say it, summaries of major Greek mythology, and of course by extension Roman mythology. And I think she ended as well, your volume allows you, with some referencing to Norse mythology as well, right? Okay, so you got a little bit about Thor and some of the other gods and that kind of thing. I believe your volume has that at the very end. Now, what do we mean when we talk about these Greeks? Have we talked at all about our timeline yet? Did we do a little timeline introduction yet? Okay, so you're probably familiar with this game that academics get to play. Let's play it together now. Where you draw a little line on the paper there. It looks kind of like that. And you've got it kind of looks like a number line, doesn't it? And you draw a line down the center of the page, or down the center of the line, like this. We designate this as 0, correct? Now, for your notes, this is what we call the Western timeline. Now, by Western, I don't mean Louis L'Amour, let's go shoot cowboys and that kind of thing, Western. I mean everything from Europe West. That's what I'm talking about. We use that term that way. And when we designate our 0, what is the designation of the 0 for the Western timeline? The birth of Christ. You got it. So we got the birth of Christ there. And then we divide these up, right, into 100-year segments that we call centuries, right? So we sit out here, for example, at 2013, which we call the what? 21st century, and that's how we write that. The 21st century, okay, with a C around it. And then we can go the opposite direction. So we talk about events which are before the Common Era, and events that we will call Common Era are sometimes referred to in the old days as AD, right? Okay. So, for example, Tommy and his pals, we'll study this in 24 months. Tommy and his pals wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of not property, happiness." All of that was written in what year? Do you remember? What year was that document, what it's called the what? Declaration of Independence. Written in what year? Do you recall? It's what? 1776. Don't say it right at what century? Don't say it right at what century? Okay? Right? So here we are at 2013, but we're going up a number to get to the 21st century, right? So here we are at 1776, so we're going to call this the what? 18th century, right? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in what? 1492, right? 8 years from what century? Don't say it right. 8 years from what century? Well, 1492 is what century? 1492 is the 15th century, right? So we're 8 years from what century? The 16th century. Dude, this is so confusing to me. Like, it's 1776. Why can't we just call it the 17th century? That'd make it a whole lot easier for me. And now I got to do mathematics and add a number, and 1776 becomes the 18th century. Why can't we just call it 17th century if it's 1700? The answer is simple. We start with 0 and we start numbering up, right? 50, 60, 70, 80, 99, 100. We call that the first century. 150, 180, 198, 199, 200. We call that the second century, even though the numbers are in the 100s. Make sense? Which will explain why when we hit 1776, we're talking about the 18th century. Now, this game can get played the opposite direction as well, and the date I want you to write down now is 399 BCE. Anybody know why that's an important date for us? Anybody know? 399 BCE. That's the year that who drank hemlock? They poisoned him, and he died. Who's the great philosopher that we'll spend a lot of time talking about? Socrates. You got it. So 399 BCE will be the death of Socrates, and that's one of those easy dates we want to throw in our brain. let's go ahead and write 200 as the rise of Rome. And of course, we'll talk about the fall of Rome in 410. So Rome falls in 410, which means Rome is roughly how old? We're talking about 200 BCE, and 410 is the fall of Rome. We're going to add 200 to 410, and so we're talking roughly what? 600 years of history, right? Now, when we take into consideration the Greek culture as well as the Roman culture, we will call that collectively the Greco-Roman culture. You got me? Okay, the Greco-Roman culture. The Greeks, Edith Hamilton calls it a miracle, almost miraculously began to create amazing works of art of any number of kinds. Why did they start doing this? That becomes one of the interesting questions in the study of classics. Why is there nothing in regards to the kind of art, and then all of a sudden we got this prodigious amount of art and speculative science? Before Pythagoras, we don't have the kind of mathematics that we have with Pythagoras. You, of course, know Pythagoras by virtue of that theorem that he made so famous. But why? Well, he didn't start out in mathematics. He started out in the humanities and musicology. He was a musicologist. He liked to study harmonics and that kind of thing. But why all of a sudden are all of these people doing this amazing work? A few years ago, I took students to Athens, and we took a look at some of that architecture. And they stood in front of the Parthenon. How can you explain that human beings could create something like this? And you know, they're like wonder about that. We still wonder about that. What we do say is simply, thank you, right? Thank you. Why? Because the beginnings of Western culture happened for us with this classic moment that Edith Hamilton calls the Greek miracle happening at that moment. Okay? Now, what is it that the Greeks gave to us that's so important? Well, they gave us a view of the world that will have tremendous influence for our civilizations, okay, coming forward. What is that view of the world? How much time do I have? 5. Good. What is that view of the world? Can I erase this? What is that view of the world? Well, it posits an interesting kind of epistemology. What did you just call me? Epistemology. Of or relating to the Greek root epistis, of or relating to knowledge. Okay, knowledge. The Greeks saw the world kind of like this. First, there are the gods. Okay? Now these gods live on Mount Olympus. If you travel north out of Athens for about an hour and a half, a little more, you will see this very famous mountain called Mount Olympus. And they kind of imagine that the gods sit up there on this mountain. They see their gods, the Greeks, see their gods in anthropomorphic forms. What does that mean? Butterfield, I need more focus out of you. Anthropomorphic forms. What does that mean? They see their gods in the divine form of anthrop. What's anthrop mean? Humans. Humans, right. So gods in the form of humans. So when the Greeks think about Apollo, when they think about Aphrodite, they picture in their mind a human being. That's what we mean by anthropomorphic. Okay? And the way they think about these gods is they sit up there on Mount Olympus at the top there, and they kind of like watch big screen TVs. What are they watching? They're watching humans. Humans down on earth doing all kinds of craziness, right? And every once in a while, these gods jump out from Mount Olympus, and they will go down into the world where they will mingle and do all kinds of craziness with human beings. Okay? Down below the gods are humans. Okay? Humans. Now, what makes gods gods? Two things. One, they're immortal. That is to say, they do not die. Right? They live forever. They do not die. Two, they have all knowledge. They're omniscient. They know everything. They know the past, they know the present, and a lot of times they even know the future. Okay? Well, what are humans? Well, humans are defined as exactly the opposite. Humans are defined obviously as mortal, right? And in terms of knowledge, they've got very limited knowledge, right? I mean, we know a little bit about today. We know something about yesterday. Dude, we got no knowledge really of yesterday other than predicting, right? That's it. In between then, what to do? In between then, the gods and humans are what they call the poets, what we would call artists. or the artists in the house, you're going to love this. Okay? The idea that the Greeks invent, and again, Edith Hamilton calls it a miracle, and it's really remarkable that they come up with this idea. They imagine that the gods have special knowledge that the gods will give to very, very special people that they call poets, we call artists. They will, and the Greeks invent this phrase, they will inspire. Literally means God breathed. They will inspire the poets with this knowledge. The poets then will share that information with humans in the form of creative works, whether that be in writing, or that be in sculpting, or building, or whatever. Okay? And for the Greeks then, the most important people in their culture are those guys right there. Why? Because they give humans information humans could not have on their own. Which is why, when in a few years we pick up the Iliad and the Odyssey and we study it closely, those texts will open with what's called an invocation of the muse. To invoke the muse means you ask, as a poet, the gods to help you tell the story you are about to tell. Now what Hamilton has done for us that's very beneficial for us as young scholars, two things. One, she gives us a lot of information about these gods right away. She says, these are basically the gods that the Greeks and the Romans messed around with. Now the Romans defeat the Greeks, and when they defeat the Greeks, they will do two things. They will adopt and adapt. They will take, literally, the ideas of the Greeks, they adopt them, but they also will kind of change them. So for example, the Romans will adopt all of the gods, but they just simply change their names. Yeah, change their names. And you know, they change a lot of times, they change the way they think of them. A classic example of this is, of course, the god of war. In the Greeks, called it who? Ares. The Romans called it Mars, right? The Greeks hated this god. They're frightened of it. They hate it. The Romans, it's one of their favorite gods. Right? They love it. Pictured on a bone, a throne of bone, human flesh hung over it with dogs of war, dogs of hell biting on all the dead bodies. The Romans loved that kind of stuff. The Greeks did not like that kind of thing. It tells you a lot about the difference between the two cultures, doesn't it? That the Greeks didn't really like that god. The Romans loved that god. Got me? Good. Finally, and in conclusion, this term mythology or myth. Now we got to be careful with this term. Because when we use this term today, right? Dude, it's snowing outside, middle of August. Dude, it's snowing outside. Yeah, that's a myth. In other words, we use the word myth to connote and to denote things that are not true. The Greeks will define mythology as stories to explain the unexplainable. That's where we'll come back on Monday. Thank you. By the way,